because that has consequences. It can seriously jeopardize our ability to stay alert for the next proceedings. I say the bigger the meal, the heavier the eyelids. So let's pray that we will all indeed stay sharp and focused as we go into our afternoon session. And this is the Brand Africa session. And it will start with a fireside chat. And this fireside chat is entitled Shifting the Narrative of Africa, to be moderated by Ms. Judith MONGALA, who is the head of Government, Politics and Non-Profit Marketing Partnerships for SSA, that's Sub-Saharan Africa, for Meta. And then we also have Ms. Moky MAKURA, who is Executive Director for Africa No Filters, who will give us her speech. So let's put our hands together for Ms. Judith MONGALA, Head of Government, Politics and Non-Profit Marketing.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Bon après-midi. Mbote. Salama. Boa tarde. Buenos tardes. Okay, I think I've tried. It's the afternoon session, and we know that you've just eaten, so the challenge before was keeping you up to speed before going on lunch, and now we want to make sure you're awake. And I think with two beautiful ladies, if I may say, such as myself and Moky, I think we can keep you up to speed and keep your attention. So welcome to this session. We really have been going through almost 2 days now of exciting discussions, from how to brand our image as Africans, as the African continent, to what can we do better. And we want to make sure that this session is really interactive. You've heard, you know, from the minister himself yesterday, and he said that with all the brain powers we have in the room, a real shift can be made. But I think there was also some wording that was said earlier by our MC that, no, it wasn't our MC, it was the session we had previously by Moinia, who said that, you know, it's good to have potential, but obviously if there's no action, nothing can really be done. And I think we want to make sure that this 30 minutes is all about discussion, tangible ideas that you can bring with you. And with that, I had the opportunity about 2 days ago when I got here on Sunday to meet a remarkable woman who's just so fascinating. She's had such an amazing journey, and she's an expert in her own right, and she's going to tell us everything from insights to how she's shifting the narrative in terms of storytelling, bringing negativity to positivity. And I want to invite her on stage so we can have a very interesting, insightful conversation. So inviting on stage Moky. Thank you.
So we're going to sit here.
Well. Okay, perfect. All right. Well, as I said, Moky, welcome again. It's just been interesting to spend 2 days with you, having, you know, lots of conversations from women to what the Africa Filter is. So just to introduce you again, Moky is the Executive Director of Africa No Filter. She really focuses in terms of her mission on shifting narrative from negative to positive storytelling. And with that, I just want to invite you to tell us a bit more of what is Africa No Filter.
Great. Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for coming back after lunch. I know some of you are going to take away for a bit of a nap, maybe. But I have this wonderful opportunity to talk about the work that has driven me, and it's a passion of mine. I run an organization called Africa No Filter, which is a narrative change organization. We are trying to shift those stereotypical perceptions that the world, and to a certain extent us as Africans, still have about the continent and about ourselves. That we are broken, that we lack the agency to create the change, that we are dependent. So those are the things that we're working on. And the way we do it is that we realize that in order to change a narrative, you have to change the stories that feed that narrative. And actually, we've just commissioned some research from a professor at Bath University who's an expert in stereotypes. And he's confirmed that the only way to stop people thinking about something negative is not to counter it. So for example, you can't say Africa is not a poor continent. That's not going to change anything. You have to show that Africa is a wealthy continent through stories. So we know we're on the right track with what we're doing, and essentially we do two things. We build communities, so we're building a community of storytellers who are mission aligned, who care about how the world sees Africa and how Africa sees itself, but also we do advocacy. So platforms like this, for me, is a moment to do advocacy around this mission, that, you know what, I have heard so many people talk about the need to change the narrative about Africa. And I'm going to ask, by show of hands, how many people are actually doing anything to change the narrative about Africa? Okay. Good, good. Thank you. Because an organization like ours exists because there is a need for it. I think on the scale at which we need to do it, we're still working on that. But platforms like this to try and get people to understand that storytelling is critical. Stories inspire, they inform, they educate. And that's what we need to change the narrative. So
Love that. I just love that. And I think yesterday we were obviously brainstorming on what can we do better. I think we talked about, can we bring conversations? Can we bring ideas? Can we think about what is it that we're putting first in terms of positivity versus, you know, the usual negative thing, we don't have this, we don't have, why don't we work with what we actually have to move forward? And this is actually the beginning of everything. Just to maybe dig a bit deeper, you talked about, obviously, the study that you did. I'm also quite curious, I think there was a report that you worked on. Would you tell us a bit more about, I'm just thinking of, in the sense of, we talk about how do we bring these stories? They come from conversations, they come from content, but there's also channels. Media obviously plays a big role. A company like Meta is also obviously one social media. Everybody is on social media. We know the statistics. So I'm just curious about what are the key takeaways from the current global index report that you did. Can you tell us a bit more?
Great. So a little while ago, actually quite recently, we launched something called the Global Media Index. And that's because we are an evidence-based organization, so we don't like to say global media paints Africa in a terrible way. We wanted the evidence. So what we did, we looked at 20 global publications or global media outlets who cover Africa. So everything from Al Jazeera to CNN to Bloomberg to, name them, FT, Wall Street Journal, all of them were on there. And what we found was that, yes, the topics that they tend to cover about Africa still continue to be the ones about poverty, conflict, corruption, poor leadership, you know, it's political, it's elections. We found that those topics still are the predominant ones they cover. Also that they cover very little around culture, tourism, just some of the things that we actually do very well. But the one thing that I think, you know, really struck me was that these media outlets say that they cover Africa. The media organization that had the most countries covered was actually AFP. They covered 30 countries, just over 30 countries. There are 54 countries in Africa. On average, most of them were covering about 17 countries. So when we say that global media is covering Africa not in a good way, they're actually not even covering half the countries. So there's a lot more work we need to do, and that's an example of just one of the one piece of research we did. And I'll tell you this quickly. One of the big findings from that research is that men still represent the voice of Africa. In a lot of those stories, men were the ones who were being quoted. They were always the expert voice. Women were very often not seen, as we saw on one or two panels today.
I was just about to highlight that, and I was hoping you would be the devil's advocate.
I wasn't going to say anything, but yeah.
You just couldn't help it, but I agree with you. I think we need more women voices, right? And I think just having this representation with both of us here on this panel says a lot. And maybe just to add on that, we as Meta, I think I just want to highlight, I know a few people have introduced myself as Meta, and everybody's wasn't quite sure, was it a meteorological company or something like that, just to reinforce that. Obviously, Meta is an umbrella of many platforms, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. And 4 years ago, actually talking about storytelling, we launched a program called From Africa to the World, because I think that there is this misinterpretation or misperception that we actually have to model what other people are doing in other continents. We need to tell our stories from where we are. If I'm from Congo, I want people to eat fufu. I want them to know what our dress looks like, the liputa. If I'm going to Nigeria, I want to listen to Afrobeats, and so on and so forth. There's so many ways to diversify, but also show our culture from within to the world. And as we speak about that, there's obviously this is really about breaking the stereotypes, right? Because all we are known for is, you know, African, not enough money, not enough knowledge, but there's everything else. There's diversity, there's culture, there's richness, there's just so much we have to offer. And I know that that's a big piece of what you do in terms of advocating, in terms of telling the positive story and not focusing on what's negative. Can you tell us a bit more in that space? Are there other initiatives that you're doing that's focused on specifically stereotype?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big initiatives that we made, and I know I'm speaking a lot about media, but we also support the creative industries. In fact, we're one of the few funders of the arts in Africa. But one of the things that we did for the media sector, because when we did a report called How African Media Covers Africa, which again, I always say, in Africa, when you point one finger, there are three pointing back at you, right? So we wanted to, instead of pointing fingers at global media, we wanted to look and see how we as Africans were covering the continent. And what we found was that if you are sitting in Kenya reading about Nigeria, you are reading exactly the same content that somebody in Paris or New York is reading, in that there is no difference. Because a lot of the local media are getting their news about the rest of Africa from AFP, Reuters, from BBCs. So what we did was we actually launched our own news service. It's called Bird, it's online, and we put out 2 narrative-changing stories every day on the continent. And those are stories of progress. Stories that just talk about some of the amazing individuals doing interesting things that are pushing this continent forward. Because believe it or not, if we don't do it, nobody's going to come and do it for us. But we also do data stories, you know, just stories that are there hiding in plain sight, which, you know, nobody's going to look for them unless we start looking for them. So we have 150 media partners that take our content, and they're all African media outlets. So hopefully Africans are going to start seeing more positive stories about Africa, because we've talked about the fact, I was really interested to hear that, you know, the guy from Radisson said that his biggest market was from Africa. Now, if you are sitting in Kenya and you're reading negative news about the rest of the continent, you're not coming to Zambia for tourism. So we really have to work on what we as Africans know about each other. And that's why the tagline for Bird is actually content that connects the continent. Because I want to know what Zambia is doing or what I can come and do in Zambia. But if I can't find that information anywhere, I'm going to go to Europe, quite frankly. And that's why I think this Brand Africa thing is an excellent idea. There has to be somewhere where I can go to look at what's on offer in Africa.
Thank you so much, Moky. I remember reading obviously about you. You know, when you're about to be in a panel with someone, you want to make sure that you can understand who they are and be in their skin, you know?
They call it stalking.
Exactly. Well, not really, but you know. And you know, I love that you had that quote that basically said that, you know, until a lion can tell his story, obviously the hunter is always going to be, you know, the hero in the story, right? And even Maya Angelou actually says that, you know, not telling a story is basically where you're dying. You're dying as a continent because nobody sees you, nobody hears you. And I think I just want to encourage everyone in the room. And obviously we're in an era of social media. Can I just have a sense of who's on Facebook? Can everybody just lift their hands if they are? Who's on Instagram? Okay, so at least some are Instagram, Facebook, and it's good to know, because obviously this is a space where everybody's on. I mean, the youth, we know that Africa, we're talking about by 2050, you know, the population is going to rise. We're talking about the fact that, you know, 60% is under 25 years old, so that also means it's a mobile age, right? And how are you thinking about that transition as we think about, you know, narrative, storytelling, the role of social media in that space as well, and obviously somebody like you that's really focused on pushing forward those channels and those stories. How are you thinking about the role that social media can really play in these spaces?
Yeah, it's not that I think about the role it plays. I think social media is the answer.
Yeah.
Because I think the days of us, you know, waiting for, you know, international media to come and do a big story on, you know, on Livingston or, you know, the Big Falls, I think are gone. And I think there's low-hanging fruit here. You know, if you look at the types of influencers, I think the most popular category of influencers on social media, lifestyle, then there's fashion, there's beauty, there's others. But travel is a huge category in that you have a bunch of people who are already doing tourism work for you and are not even asking for money. For me, that's the biggest, lowest hanging opportunity, I think, for the tourism industry, to bring these people together, turn them into a community. So all the people who are content creators who are creating content about Zambia should be part of the community. The tourism industry should be connected to them because they are doing the work to spread the news. The second thing I think that should be happening is that platforms like yours, like Instagram and Facebook, you know, when you put a post out, you can just hope and pray that your friends see it. Or if you're really strategic about it, you buy Facebook ads, you buy Instagram ads, you buy Google ads. They work because it's targeted. You know, if you're targeting a particular type of tourist, you know, white, American, lots of money, you know, you can target them in America through Facebook, through everywhere else. So for me, I think that the information is there, the platforms are there, and that we need to realize that tourism is changing. And, you know, I asked, there's a young lady here in the room over there who, you know, I was chatting to her about the type of tourist, because I think there's still this belief that, you know, it's big money, you're coming on big safari. I think there's a lot more young people who want different types of experiences, right? So I have an organization, or I know of an organization in London that curates African experiences. They would not call themselves a tourist organization, but that's the new type of tour operator that we're dealing with. Sure. And I'll say this really quickly. The other day I was on Instagram, as one is, and I saw this lady who, she was a Nigerian living in London, and she had gone to Lagos, bought a flight, to get her hair done, get her nails done, and she left that night. That is beauty tourism. That's a whole new category of tourist who comes in, spends their money in the local industry, and I thought that was cool. And that says to me that the way we think about tourists should be different, because it's a much broader category than I think we imagine. So yeah, social media is the solution.
I just want to double down on that because it's such a key focus, because I think we don't talk about it often. I mean, obviously, Meta is about to sign an MOU with the UN in terms of specifically driving capacity building for influencers. We are looking at monetization. It's already launched in Nigeria, it's launched in South Africa, it's imminent in Kenya, and we want to do more for the continent, because obviously why? I think it's important to explain the process. You have content creators that, of course, are born even from, you know, Instagram and Facebook, creating all this content, building careers, and then moving on to monetization, which obviously inspires them to even sell or write better quality, put together more beautiful videos, which will showcase the continent to the world. So it all ties in, it becomes an ecosystem. And when you think about tourism industry, border tourism, those are actually your ambassadors. A good example that I can take is Elsa Majimbo, for example. She's Kenyan. She's a young influencer that started off basically telling stories about Kenya during the pandemic, you know, and just showcasing the different tourism destinations that are in Kenya. And she plugged into Meta, and now she has about 2.1 million followers. I mean, just think about the power of a young person that is relatable, not a white American coming to see a safari and lions, but actually a Kenyan women that's 22, explaining that to the world and attracting the world. I think Jan talked about some of those examples. We talk about breasure, it's called now. Business leisure, basically, because as you said, people are traveling for leisure, people are traveling to shop, people are traveling to just relax. Some, of course, are continuing to do the safaris, etc. Some are just meeting their family. Some are just interested to actually learn about your music and your food. And we're not finding ways to tap all that and zoom it into the different channels that are available. Another example is, for example, Mark Angels, comedian Nigerian. He's got, I think, 122 million followers. I mean, the power of that is enormous. And if we thought about the different buckets of taking tourism, your influencers that are brand ambassadors, and then plugging all that in to create a platform where all that can live, for example, that of course can be driven by UN Tourism in partnership with Board of Tourism Ministries, we could do really a lot. So that gets me excited. Sorry, I think I spoke a lot, but anyway. Now just shifting gears a bit, I think just for the audience, I think what would be good is to talk about some tangible things that you've seen from the content and discussions we had yesterday in strengthening Brand Africa. How do you tie it in with Africa No Filter? How do we bring this back with such a big audience? Because I think that's really the key takeaway. What are the things that you think we can do quite rapidly in a tangible way without necessarily big budgets, but just bringing all our brains together?
I mean, just thinking, because I'm not from this industry, which makes me an excellent spokesperson for this role that I'm about to take on, which is to tell you what I think we should be doing. So, please, take it with a pinch of salt. But one of the things I really think is important, because I've noticed that some people say, oh yeah, but we're doing tourism in X country. And I'm like, okay, so what do you have? And there's always a moment where it's not clear. What are the tourism assets? Why are people coming? Why should I come? That should roll off your tongue. It should be easy. And I think each country should have an asset register of your tourist assets, so that it's easy for people to understand, why am I coming to Liberia? Why am I coming to Sierra Leone? Why am I going to Nigeria? And I think that once you understand what people would potentially come and pay for, then it's easier to figure out a strategy around it. And I'll give an example, for example, of Nigeria. Dirty December, I don't know if everybody knows what Dirty December is, but it's clean. But Dirty December is a time when diaspora Nigerians go back home, and that's when all the big stars, Wizkid, Davido, were now performing. And it's now become a thing. So people go to Nigeria in December. Now that's an opportunity. You have a huge number of people coming in. Hotels, Airbnbs, other things, shopping, all the other things that we know Nigerians like doing could be programmed around that time. And in fact, if we like it in December, why don't we do it twice a year? So I'm saying that sometimes those assets that we think or we don't think we have, is when you sit down and you realize that actually, you know what? Nigeria started Afrobeats. We're the home of Afrobeats. That is such a massive opportunity. If you're not dancing to Afrobeats, your children are. So if there's opportunities to come to festivals, Afrobeats festivals in Nigeria, for example, that is it. So I feel that if what we could do is have more conferences like this where we're talking about examples, case studies of what is working in this new world of tourism, because that's what I'm not seeing right now. I'm not seeing enough examples of where we're having success stories. And my last thing I'll say is that, I live a bit in Cape Town as well. And every time, I tell people like, I live in Cape Town, people say, oh God, I love Cape Town, it's my favorite place. But the sentence before, they'd be like, oh yeah, Africa, I'm not sure about that. Because they've somehow disassociated Cape Town from the rest of the continent and its problems, because its marketing is so successful. It is so clear about its assets. Its infrastructure for tourism seems to be working, despite the political problems that the country might have. So when we see problems, often the solution is already there facing us. We just need to focus on the progress, focus on what's working. And I think that's the beginning.
I agree with you. I mean, if you think about,
yes.
Can we just approach it?
Thank you.
Moky for president.
Yes.
Brand for Africa. Yes, Brand for Africa. No, I mean, I was just thinking as you were speaking, of course, another example is Ghana, for example, is then the same, the year of return. And where it becomes beautiful is that it's no longer even known as Ghana. It's now known as the year of return. When you say year of return for a brand, everybody knows it's Ghana, and that's where you want to be as a country, that people actually know what your creative assets speaks to and identifies you, and people are actually excited to go there. And just thinking about obviously the different components of things you've said, media for sure is really another big space that you really tap into. And I'm just curious as to what are the other things that you think the traditional medias, for example, should be doing as well, because it's obviously a big ecosystem. We have the social media, we have radio, we have TV, we have all this pulling together. And this is where through the information is disseminated in terms of content. Is there something that you think also that could evolve from media?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should ignore media, because media brands that are influential are still very powerful, and they do have influence. But the thing that we have realized, and I know, is that journalists behave a particular way. There is a way that journalists are taught to write stories. And journalists often don't go looking for good news. That's not what they're paid to do. And if you are, for example, running a global outlet, you have the world to choose from. Why am I going to choose a story from Africa? And there is that thing about if it bleeds, it leads. So they're looking for disaster because naturally, I think we will click on stories where 20 people died versus one person hurt their leg, right? So I think it's, it's reflecting society. So what we've realized is that if you want journalists to behave differently, the solution is not necessarily to train journalists, right? Because at the end of it, their editors still require a certain type of storytelling. So we've stopped doing that. We don't train journalists. What we've tried to do is train journalists or change the way they see their work. A question we ask journalists, for example, is, when you set out to be a journalist, was your intention to get people depressed and not read your stories and shut down your newspaper? Because that's actually what's happening. People, there's a genuine thing called news avoidance right now because people are tired of sad and bad news. I actually run a panel called New News, right? Which is about, like, there's a new type of news. And that's why there's a popularity, massive explosion of social media influencers, particularly in Nigeria. I'll talk about, I know there's skits, like comedians. People just putting out funny, entertaining content, and that's what people want. So when I say that, it's harder work to train journalists because of the way they've been set up, the way the media world is set up. But the thing is that if you're pushing interesting stories, because the one thing that we have to be clear about, a story is not interesting just because it's a story and just because you think it is. A story has to have certain things, in it, and that's what we're trying to get people to understand, that storytelling is a skill. So you cannot just put your lowest person as head of communications or head of storytelling. It's a strategic role. You've got to have a skill set. You need to understand what makes stories compelling. So I think there is work to do in terms of just understanding storytelling. What makes an interesting story and why would you read it? And that's something we grapple with on Bird every day because we put out 2 stories a day. What makes that story interesting? It's in the headline and it's in the content. And I think at the end of the day, it's not positive news because I'm always very clear that journalists get very reluctant when you tell them, come and write good stories about my country. They're like, why? I'm not your PR person, we don't pay you. And it's not their job. So you have to be careful about how we frame journalists need to do this. They don't need to do anything. Yeah. You have to incentivize them, not financially, but by giving them good stories, giving them access, showing them actually that, this stuff is interesting. Right? And it's not necessarily paying me, it's actually in your interest as a journalist to write a story that people want to read.
Yeah.
So,
and I think there's a lot of de-learning and learning because obviously we've been framed into this space of, and like as they say in Nigeria, no wahala, nobody wants to read about it, right? So, but it's about thinking of the nice, great, beautiful, interesting wahalas that we actually want to hear from. Yeah. And just to maybe take away some of the points you said, I think just to recap, obviously you talked about the fact that we should really focus on our creative assets. I think that's really one big takeaway, that tourist assets specifically, and thinking about, what is it that we have that we want to put out there in a positive way. How do we reshift, our thinking in terms of, owning our spaces and telling our stories better. I think there's also a need for obviously bringing all the ecosystem together in terms of, literally from grassroots, having everyone in the ecosystem, your creators, your influencers, the board of tourism, the UNs, everyone together. And then of course, people like you that can help us also elevate. What are the other things that you can do? Is there any other takeaway that you want to bring to us?
Well, it's not so much a takeaway as an observation. So I'm sitting here listening to all the sessions, and I strongly believe that there was nothing necessarily new that was said today, which means we've heard it before. And my sort of question is, next year, when this happens, are we going to be having the same conversation, all things without having a perfect ecosystem? Because one of the sessions they talked a lot about the connectivity. We're not going to fix that immediately, but it doesn't mean that people can't come to your country. And people will come, and that was a point that was raised in the room yesterday, that people will come. If there's something fun and exciting to do, they will find a way to get there. And then private sector follows, because now they see an opportunity. So I feel that I always have this thing, and where you see 2 Africans fighting and nobody's actually holding them back. And they're like, no, stop me. No, and nobody's actually holding you back. And I think to a certain extent that there's nothing holding back the tourism industry. And my biggest fear is that Africa is having a moment right now. The world is looking at us. They're dancing to our music, they're eating our food, they're watching our films, they're wearing our clothing. And we have only a moment in time to take advantage of this. And if it goes, boom, then the next country is going to come up, the next fad is going to come up. And I think that we don't have the luxury of just saying, hey, we'll get to that next year. Oh yeah, we're going to fix the connectivity issues, we're going to fix the visa issues. Let's do it now.
Thank you, Moky. I think you've said it all. Thank you. Nothing else to add. I was going to say facts, points taken, it's actions now that we need to see. So, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.